Hi, my name is Adam and I am a health and safety consultant at High Performance Consultancy, and in this video I'll be talking about workplace first aid requirements. I'll talk about what employers need to do, then I'll explain about first aid needs assessments, first aid arrangements, and finally I'll explain about the first aid facilities you may need within your businesses. Okay, so what do employers need to do? Employers must take appropriate first aid arrangements for the workplace. In doing so, they should consider the circumstances of the workplace, workforce and health and safety risks that may present to help them decide what arrangements they need to put in place. Some smaller risk workplaces need to have only a first aid box and a person appointed to take charge of first aid arrangements, such as calling the emergency services and stocking the first aid box. If your workplace has more significant health and safety risks, for example used machinery or hazardous materials, then you're more likely to need a trained first aider. In order to establish what provision for first aid is required, the employer should make an assessment of the first aid needs appropriate to the circumstances of their business. We call this a first aid needs assessment. This should include consideration of the workplace, the workforce, and the hazards and risks present. The HSE doesn't specify what provision should be made for first aid. It is the employer who is best placed to understand the exact nature of their workplace and decide what they need to provide. First aid provision must be adequate and appropriate in the circumstances. This means the employer must provide sufficient first aid equipment, facilities and personnel at all times. Following an employer's first aid needs assessment, the employer might decide that it will be beneficial to have personnel trained to identify and understand symptoms and able to support someone who might be experiencing a mental health issue. Employers should consider ways to manage mental ill health in their workplace which are appropriate for their business, such as providing information or training for managers and employees, employing occupational health professionals, appointing mental health trained first aiders, and implementing employee support programs. First aid training courses covering mental health teach delegates how to recognise warning signs of mental ill health and help them to develop the skills and confidence to approach and support someone while keeping themselves safe. A company's first aid arrangements will depend on the outcome of their first aid needs assessment and the particular circumstances in the workplace at any given time. The findings of the needs assessment should indicate the level of first aid equipment, facilities and personnel required. As a minimum, all companies must have a suitably stocked first aid kit, an appointed person to take charge of first aid arrangements, information for all employees giving details of the first aid arrangements. Where a company needs assessment identifies workplace or workforce issues or more significant health and safety risks, the company is likely to need a sufficient number of appropriately trained first aiders and may need to arrange additional equipment and facilities. Companies may need to provide a suitable first aid room where the needs assessment identifies that one is required. This will usually be necessary in large premises or where high hazards are present. The room should be easily accessible and a designated person should be given responsibility for supervising it. Wherever possible, a first aid room should be reserved exclusively for the purposes of first aid. First aid room should be large enough to hold an examination or medical couch, have washable surfaces and adequate heating, ventilation and lighting, be kept clean, tidy and accessible and available for use all times when employees are at work. Ideally, they'd have a sink with hot and cold running water, be positioned as near as possible to the point of access for transport to hospital, display a notice on the door advising of the names, locations, and if appropriate, contact details of first aiders. This information should be displayed in other appropriate places also. High Performance Consultancy are excited to be offering first aid and mental health first aid courses. For further information on how we can assist you with first aid requirements or to book onto one of our courses, please get in touch.